The never-ending bus ride. Mark was exhausted. His shift at the warehouse had dragged on longer than usual, and by the time he stepped onto the last city bus home, his eyelids felt like lead. He barely registered the handful of passengers already seated: the old man near the front, the woman in the business suit staring at her phone, the guy in a hoodie slumped against the window. He dropped into a seat near the middle, rubbing his face. The familiar hum of the engine, the soft sway of the bus, the rhythmic whoosh of doors opening and closing, it all blurred together, lulling him into much-needed rest. When his eyes fluttered open, the first thing he noticed was the darkness outside. The second was the time on his phone, 2:47 a.m. His stop should have come long ago. He sat up, frowning. The city streets were unrecognizable. No neon signs, no familiar storefronts, no landmarks he could place. Just long, empty roads stretching into the distance, broken only by the occasional flickering streetlight. Mark glanced round. The bus was still moving, but the old man was gone. The woman in the business suit wasn't there anymore either. Only the guy in the hoodie remained, still slumped in his seat, face turned away. Mark stood, gripping a pole as he moved toward the front. The driver was a heavy-set man in a navy uniform, his hands steady on the wheel. Mark cleared his throat. "Hey, I think I missed my stop." The driver didn't respond. Mark frowned. "Excuse me." "Nothing." The man's hands remained on the wheel, his gaze fixed straight ahead. Mark stepped closer, hesitating. "Where are we?" The driver blinked once but didn't turn his head. His mouth barely moved as he spoke. "Sit down." His voice was flat, like someone repeating a phrase they'd been told to say. Mark's stomach tightened. He turned back toward the seats, heart pounding. The guy in the hoodie still hadn't moved. Mark hesitated before stepping toward him. "Hey, man, do you know where we are?" No response. Mark reached out, shaking the man's shoulder. His body was cold. The hoodie slipped back, revealing a pale, expressionless face. The skin was smooth, waxy, like plastic. The eyes were open, but empty, glassy and unfocused. Mark staggered backward, his breath catching. He turned toward the doors, gripping the railing. The streets outside were getting worse. The lamplight spun at unnatural angles, stretching toward the road like reaching fingers. The pavement was cracked, but not in a normal way. Lines split and reformed as if the road were breathing. Buildings, when they appeared, were hollow structures, windowless and dark, shifting as the bus passed.
Mark turned back to the driver. "Stop the bus." The driver didn't react. Mark rushed to the doors, pressing his hands against the metal. "Let me off." The driver spoke again, the same flat tone. "Sit down." Mark grabbed the emergency release handle. It didn't budge. He pulled harder. The driver spoke again. "Don't." Mark turned, sweat dripping down his back. "Why not?" The driver didn't answer. Mark's hands shook. He turned to the nearest window and slammed his fist against it. The glass didn't even shudder. He turned back to the driver. "Where are we going?" The driver blinked, his mouth moving just enough to form words. "Home." Mark's pulse pounded in his ears. "I don't live here. This isn't my home." The driver said nothing. Mark backed away, scanning the empty seats, the dark landscape outside. The road stretched endlessly, curving in ways it shouldn't. The bus turned onto a bridge, but there was no water below, just more road, spiraling into the black. His legs felt weak. The guy in the hoodie hadn't moved. Mark forced himself to breathe, gripping the seat beside him. His phone. Maybe he could call someone. He yanked it from his pocket, but the screen was blank. Not off, just empty. No time, no apps, no background. He tapped it. Nothing happened. A soft hum filled the air. It took Mark a second to realize it wasn't coming from the bus. It was coming from the passengers. He turned, his breath catching. More people were on the bus now. Rows of them. Silent. Motionless. They hadn't been there a minute ago. They weren't breathing. Their heads were slightly tilted, all facing forward, staring at nothing. Mark stumbled back. The bus was speeding up. "Stop." He lunged for the driver again. "Let me off." The driver's hands tightened on the wheel. The bus lurched, taking a sharp turn, and Mark crashed into a seat. He gasped, pushing himself up. The road ahead was splitting. Pieces of asphalt crumbled into the darkness below, yet the bus kept moving. Mark turned, his chest tight. The passengers were moving now, slowly, their heads turning toward him in unison. Their eyes were still blank, but their mouths were moving, soundless, whispering something he couldn't hear. The driver spoke again, his voice barely above a whisper. You're almost home. Mark's heart slammed against his ribs. The road ahead was breaking apart, spiraling in ways that made no sense. The headlights flickered. The passengers were rising from their seats. Mark grabbed the handle on the door one last time and pulled with everything he had. The bus lurched. A noise deep, guttural, like metal tearing filled the air. The lights burst. The bus plunged forward. And then, Mark woke up. The bus was stopped. The doors were open. A cold breeze drifted in. He sat up, gasping, heart racing. The seats were empty. The driver was gone. Outside, the city was silent. He stepped off the bus. His hands were shaking.
The bus pulled away behind him, its engine humming softly as it disappeared down an empty street. Mark turned, his breath visible in the cold air. He knew this place. He had never been here before.